Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CDO Magazine interview series. I'm Subhash Kari, an Executive President and Chief Innovation Officer at Infocepts, overseeing our global practices and delivery organization. Today, I have with me Mr. Denish Bhavsar, Director of Global Data Governance at McCain Foods. Denish, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of operating models have you considered, and how do you go about making decisions about what is going to fit for your organization?
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? It has to be fit for purpose. So one of the first things I would always suggest is making sure that the data governance practice that you're looking to embark on is fit for purpose and it's right size for the pace as well, both the scope and pace. So three models I typically have looked at in the past is one is a fully centralized model, which is great when you have a centralized data governance team overlooking all the practices and the policies, but also the enforcement of those policies. And that's great if you have a smaller organization that a core team can basically have access to, right? Then you have the right-hand side, which I would say is a fully federated model, fully decentralized model where you have data governance embedded in all aspects of the organization, multi-regional, for example. And that's great from an organization that's probably very mature, and it's a very good target state to work towards. But what I found usually in the past is this hybrid model. So, and it's a mix of having a centralized data governance team that has the policies and practices, but then works very closely with the business to embed those practices. And again, going back to either a data domain approach, where you can look at various aspects like finance domain, HR, your typical data domains, or you can take a geography or regional based approach, and typically that can work as well. What I've usually found is that data domain approach works really well because then you actually have the key stakeholders, the key users of that data, the consumers of that data in one room, essentially, and that data ownership I think comes along a lot easily than geographically spread out. So the hybrid model is one that I've leveraged quite a bit.
Sure. Great. I think, yeah, and I think as I think more and more organizations are moving towards decentralized data warehousing, right? I mean, of course, everyone has about the concept of like data mesh architecture. So it sort of like talks a little bit about I think like how you're going about it as well, which is like to use a cross-functional team that includes like leadership from IT and business, and then sort of like bring I think domains into the mix.
One of the things I always sort of preach is data is not a IT problem. Data is not a data governance problem. It's a business problem, right? And so you really need business at the table and really talking about the pain points that come with the data, but also then what those possible solutions are. And that's where the collaboration works really well.
Yeah, great. So moving on, Denish, once you have sort of gotten the project off the ground, right? Like, how do you bring more stakeholders on board? How do you sort of keep the momentum going? And what kind of change management tactics or approaches have you used or recommend?
Yeah, so I think change management is critical in any transformation program. We want to make sure that we have the business buy-in at the beginning, and so adoption is critical. Like I said, one of the things I typically do is if I tap into a particular process and you actually have the stakeholders from that process either within that steerco or within that group, I think works really well. So take bite-sized approach to focus on one particular area where you feel you can make an impact, where the business will see that impact. And that could be anything from, like I said, data quality to data access, what have you. I usually focus on data quality. You kind of then say, okay, here's a particular process where we feel we can make improvements on the data quality itself, and that'll help the business outcome. Once you kind of establish those use cases, build that roadmap. What does that look like over the next 12 months to 24 months? And see how those processes will make impactful decisions for the business. And once you go through that process, then you kind of build a momentum, right? Like I said, it's very much of a use case by use case approach. Show data quality improving, show how insights is helping the business make decisions quicker, and then that'll build a momentum for more sponsorship, greater sponsorship down the road.
Yeah. Great. Um, Denish, I think, how do you sort of connect the impact of data governance to business value? Are you able to connect the program success to sort of business outcomes in terms of making money, saving money, or mitigating risks, or in the case of public sector, right, with advancing sort of their mission?
Mhm. Yeah, and it's tough, right? So data in general is very tough to articulate and the benefits that come as a result of having good data analytics. Having data governance is even harder. So rather than focusing on your top line growth or your profitability, I typically just focus on operational KPIs, right? So where can we make those improvements from an operation standpoint? Typical pillars I use are one is around data quality, and you'll see we talk a lot about data quality, but data quality is one pillar. The other is around data maturity. So how are we actually building the literacy and the maturity of the organization when it comes to data itself? And then the third is really around the process and the people. So those are three pillars that I use to quantify benefits. Data quality, it can be very simple as how many automated rules you've implemented, how many attributes or fields you've actually got standardized definitions for and rules around. It could be things like how many data quality, where the benchmark has improved from a particular score for data quality on a particular field to where it's improved. So those are typical operational KPIs. From a maturity standpoint, it's things like roles and responsibilities. Do we have data ownership assigned? Do we have data stewards assigned? Do we have a council in place that's meeting on a regular basis? Do we have issues that are being raised and mitigated over time? Do we also have data literacy program in place, right? So how many employees have gone through data governance 101 or data 101? Because you ultimately want to build literacy in the organization. So those are some aspects of from a maturity standpoint. And from people standpoint, I typically focus on career development and building our talent bench. So how many of our employees have actually gone through Dataversity, for example, or how many employees have completed their certification in data governance, data management practices. So those are typical KPIs I use from a talent bench standpoint.
It's great. That's great. So, Danish, I was reading, I think, an insight report from Forbes, and I found a stat that at least 46% of organizations have experienced harm to their brand value and reputation as a result of data breaches. So one of the things that I also hope, I think, that stronger data governance practices sort of in the long term reduce, those sort of risks, I think, for the organization significantly. So certainly want the listeners to be aware that, there is a connection basically with brand value and reputation as well.
Definitely.
So moving on, Danish, I think each organization is dealing with phenomenal growth in data, right? I think there is master data, there is metadata, there is transaction data, structured, unstructured. And of course, now there is more regulation coming in terms of GDPR, CCPA, and Canada's PIPEDA.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, as a leader in this space, how do you strategize to basically deal with, such variety of data in your organization?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because we do want to make sure that, yes, although we're a partner for data and analytics in the business, we also want to be able to ensure that we have the right risk and control framework in place, right? And every organization has data risks, right? Whether they recognize what those risks are, or if they have the right controls in place, it varies, right? I think as part of data governance, we want to make sure that we highlight and identify the data risks, and then we also put in that control framework in terms of how we mitigate that. And that could be everything from operational risks, whether it be in the manufacturing space, for example, the data that's required to actually build a product. We want to make sure that those risks are mitigated, so then actually the manufacturing line is actually up and running. We also want to make sure that we are taking account of all our PII, or personal identifiable information. So in my prior life, when we have so much customer data, we want to make sure that we have all the right controls in place and it's protected. And that's everything from making sure that we have the right business case or business use of that data, making sure we have the right controls in terms of access and the environment itself. and making sure that when we actually don't need that data anymore, we safely purge that data. And that goes into the retention space. So it's important that we have those controls in place. And when we look at regulatory requirements like from GDPR, right to erasure, for example, a customer being able to call in and say, hey, I want you to delete all my data, we need to know where to go. What data do we have? Where does that data reside? Who's got access to it? How can we take the right actions to it? And then how can we actually confirm back to the customer that we've done that? And I think that's where data governance really helps, right? Because one of the things we want to make sure is that we understand what data we have, where it is, what the criticality and the sensitivity of that data is, especially when it comes to PII, and then making sure that we have the right controls in place to protect it, and need be purge it if we have to. And so that is the risk element of data governance that we have to make sure that we stay focused on, in addition to making sure we partner with the business and enable insight and decision making.
So thank you, I think, for sharing your thoughts. And I hope that our listeners would enjoy listening to this, as well as taking away and applying that in their business. Thank you, Denish.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.